here's a crazy thing. There have been 14 times that teams have traded up to the first overall pick, going back to 67, I believe. I have it right here. The first time, 1967, the Colts trade up to number 1 to get Bubba Smith. Remember that?
Oh, yeah. I was. Were you born then?
No, I wasn't.
Well,
Thanks for asking, though. A defensive tackle, which is sort of rare. But my point is that it's happened 14 times if we include the trade with the Panthers and the Bears on Friday. Never in the history of those 14 times has a team traded to number 1 and then traded back down. But let's talk about it just for the sake of talking about it. So the Panthers now control everything. They control their destiny. They get up a lot to get to number 1. They can take whatever quarterback they like. But if they like 2 quarterbacks or 3 quarterbacks, can they now sort of pit the Texans at 2 and the Colts at 4 against one another? They're in the same division. They may be willing to overpay if they're worried about the other team in the division to go up to number 1. Would that be something on your radar if you're the general manager of the Panthers?
I think it depends on who they have, but I don't know if the reason why they moved up to number 1 was to control the draft, or they really, really like one of these 2 quarterbacks. And we talked about them: C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young. I'm going to be anxious to see, and we talked about this a little bit on the emergency podcast, is if any of these quarterbacks end up pulling out of their pro days, which we're going to be covering exclusively for CBS next week. And if we show up and one of the quarterbacks is not there for the workout, then you know who the Carolina Panthers are taking. But they may look at and listen to some offers, but I don't think they were as aggressive as they were to go up and then move back down. Maybe to recoup some draft cap, but you better make sure that you got that franchise quarterback, because the ownership is definitely putting, I don't want to say pressure, but putting the squeeze on that we're going to get our franchise quarterback out of this year's draft.
So let's say you have C.J. Stroud and Bryce Young graded equally. You're the Panthers GM, and the Texans want to trade up and give you some of those draft picks back. Would you think about doing that?
Well, if I know I'm going to secure one of those 2, and I do not care which one I get, potentially, but it could be Houston that is happy with either one of those 2 and may just sit there and whatever falls, be patient, and we'll take either one and be happy as you can be going off. The interesting one will be, will the Colts move up?
Right.
To try to jump the Texans. But if Carolina moves down to 4, then you're looking into more of the project type quarterbacks that I don't believe are ready to start their first year, and that's Will Levis and Anthony Richardson.
Yeah, I heard from someone in the league prior to the trade going down on Friday that the Texans are all in on Bryce. That potentially changes because we don't know what's going to happen to the top. So we'll see. We'll see how this unfolds with pick 1, pick 2, pick 4, pick 7 less so, because we'll talk about this in a second. But the Raiders have signed Jimmy Garoppolo, which you predicted last week, and it appears to be about to be set in stone. So we'll talk about that in a second. One other thing, Rick, and you mentioned this on the emergency pod, you just mentioned a moment ago. If Bryce Young is the guy for the Panthers, if the Panthers stay put and Bryce Young doesn't work out at his pro day next Wednesday, I think is what it is, that's a clear indication that he's probably their guy. But
just so you know, so everybody understands, we'll be reporting from the Ohio State pro day on Wednesday.
Oh, yeah.
Then we'll go to Bryce Young's pro day on Thursday, and then we'll go back up to Will Levis's pro day on Friday, and then the following week we'll hit Anthony Richardson's.
Yeah, man, they're getting their money's worth. But if Bryce doesn't work out next week, that sort of lends credence to your theory. But, and we talked about this earlier before the show, and I just looked it up. Back in 2016, the Rams traded up to number 1. They took Jared Goff. He worked at his pro day on March 18th, and that trade took place. I'm not sure the exact date of it, but it took place weeks ahead of the draft. And then also back in 2012, Washington traded up to number 2. Andrew Luck went number 1. That happened weeks before the draft, too. I don't have the exact date again, but RG3 worked out at his pro day. So it would be historical for a number of reasons if a quarterback doesn't show up at his pro day based on this.
You have to look at, if you're with your crackpot research team, were those pro days before the trades, or were they after the trades were already made?
Yeah,
because that makes a difference.
I get that part. I didn't get that far into the research. I'm sure Debo will. And I call it a crack staff, not a crackpot staff. All right. So that's Panthers Bears. If you want to hear more about it, check us out in the feed. The emergency pod still stands in terms of the information. Nothing really's changed on that end. And it was a good podcast, a good 28 minutes, tight 28, as they say in the business, Rick. So check that out if you want to hear more about that. Now, let's take a look at the odds quickly. And I know you're not an odds guy. I'm not really an odds guy either, but it sort of gives you some indication of what the public is thinking based on Vegas odds of where this quarterback situation might shake out. And right now, CJ remains the favorite to be the first overall pick. And you know what? We talked about this last week, Rick, when you were at the Zach Wilson Pro Day, and he had one of the best pro days in human history. That's when the 49ers traded up to number 3. They ended up taking Trey Lance. And I say that because I think sometimes we warn ourselves every May, don't fall in love with pro days. And every March, we fall in love with pro days. And in much the same way that Zach Wilson ended up going to second overall, CJ Stroud's now the favorite, I think in part because of the way he was so accurate at the combine. Now, from an evaluator, you like to see these guys in person. You were in the stadium for some of these sessions at the combine. How much of your opinion changed watching CJ throw against air in shorts and t-shirt?
Well, when you watch it on tape, you think I mean, you're evaluating the throws. You can see the completions, but there's nothing like watching these quarterbacks throw live, because I thought, watching Will Levis's, I knew he had a strong arm, but I thought the ball really jumped off his hand at the combine. And that verified that, yeah, this guy throws a tight spiral. He can make all the throws. He can throw it on a rope 20 yards down the field, can hit all the out routes. I think it was the same thing with CJ. We talked about how accurate of a thrower he was from the pocket, but then when you actually see it with your own eyes, you see his feet, you see his release, everything just so smooth and effortless. And then Bryce Young, why the gap closed is because he elected to not do anything at the combine and wait for his pro day. So it would have been great to see all 4 stacked up in their throwing motions and the zip on the ball. I've been, fortunate enough to see Bryce play live twice in game situations and have no question about the ball coming off his hand and the velocity he needs to make all the throws in the NFL level. But the other guys, it was great to see them step up, throw at the combine. And that's the importance of the combine, is it verified some things that a lot of people seen on tape, and it actually helped CJ Stroud close that gap as potentially being the number 1 overall QB selected in this year's draft.
So if you're not watching on YouTube, the odds right now as we sit here on March 13th, CJ Stroud is minus 330 to be the first overall pick. Bryce is plus 260. Anthony Richardson is plus 475, and then Will Levis is plus 3,000. It feels like Will Levis, in the eyes of the public anyway, is a distant 4th. The NFL teams could feel differently. I know that some teams at the top of the draft board like Will Levis more than Anthony Richardson, but we got a long way to go in terms of that. Let me ask you one last thing about this, and I'm not comparing CJ to Zach. I'm just talking about when you see these guys throw against the air, if that can perhaps unfairly change your opinion. Were you moved at all off of Zach Wilson in terms of a more positive evaluation based on that pro day?
Yeah, you get a little excited about it, to be honest with you,
Okay.
when you go out and see him. But then we get back, everybody goes back into their April draft meetings, and then it starts all over again. You start punching holes in all these guys, and usually you punch so many holes in every prospect that you don't like anyone till about 2 days before the draft, and you're back in love with everyone again. So, but that's all part of the process. It happens every year, and you always got to go back to remembering what you saw on tape. And the thing that I'll say about Zach Wilson was, even though he had a great workout and he had a great year at BYU before he came out, but his was a little bit rodeo Joe cowboy type plays that he was making on the tape, rolling to his left, throwing back across his body. It was fun tape to watch, to be honest with you. But you're finding out that some of the stuff that he did in college on that tape, he has not been able to do in the NFL, because the athletes are stronger, faster, and you're not going to get away with a lot of those throws he got away with in college.
Yeah, and we're actually going to ask a question along that vein when we get to the old mailback section later in the show. So stick around for that.